Hi, this is Mr. Fernandez here. I'm going to talk to you for a short while about the national political parties in the Gilded Age. That's the era that we've been covering in this unit, Unit 6, between 1865 and roughly 1898. By the time you're done listening to this lecture and answering the questions, you should be able to describe major political party trends in the Gilded Age. So I'm going to break up the lecture into those major political party trends. There's 4 or 5 of them, and we're going to start with corruption. One of the things going on during the Gilded Age is that was, very prevalent and prominent and clear to a lot of political commentators. So that was that the parties at the national level in Washington were very much corrupt, and not everybody, and not all the time, but enough that it was considered to be one of the biggest problems of that generation. And by corruption, I mean, bribery of government officials for favors, political favors, for beneficial laws, and for the federal budget to be used in a way that benefited certain private individuals. This was, before many laws were passed later on to prevent this sort of thing. And so all the way back from the Ulysses Grant presidency through the 1890s, the political parties in Congress and the presidency were very much considered to be full of corruption. So much so that in 1871, Mark Twain had the following couple of quotes. Check them out. So that's one big trend. The other big trend is that the Republican Party was dominant during this time period at the national level. The Democrats, of course, won all the elections in the South, as I'll show you in just a little bit. But when it comes to nationally, the Republicans were the dominant party. They won almost all the elections in the Senate. Almost all the presidencies during this time period were Republican. In the House, there was a little bit more parity because Southerners elected Democrats to the House of Representatives, and there were plenty of Democrats, and of course there were other Democrats that represented some northern and Midwestern and Western states as well. But for the most part, you can see that's a sea of red there during that Gilded Age period when the Republicans dominated at the national level. Another thing to look at during this time period was that the parties both enjoyed very high voter turnout. There was a lot of passion around the political parties, around voting during this time, and one of the reasons you're going to learn about, one of the reasons for that you'll learn about in class this week. But it is important to know that there was this trend toward very, very high voter participation. 80% or more on average of people who could vote voted in presidential elections. That's huge. The parties were divided during this time period by region, ethnicity, and culture. In fact, perhaps one of the major reasons why there was such high voter turnout was that the parties said, the political party affiliation, your political party affiliation, said more about who you were as a person than about what you believed in. You'll see in just a little bit that the political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, had very few differences politically. There were some important ones, but there were few of them. The thing that drove Democrats and Republicans apart was that during this time period was that your identity was very much intertwined with your party. So if you're a Republican, you were more likely to be a white Protestant. You were more likely to be a Northerner, a Midwesterner, a Westerner, and someone who lives in cities. You're more likely to be one of the older immigrants, so you might be a German American who came before the Civil War, or whose family came before the Civil War, Scandinavian origin, Norway, Finland, those kind of places, Protestants especially, and then African Americans in the North and other places where they could vote. voted for the Republican Party, because remember, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. In the South, African Americans could not vote because of the disenfranchisement of African Americans that came with Jim Crow. The Democratic Party, of course, enjoyed the allegiance of white Southerners. In the North, Democrats enjoyed the support of German American and Irish American Catholics, not Protestants, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants who could vote. So you may or may not have already learned this, depending on when you're viewing this, but during this time period, a lot of Italians were coming to this country, a lot of Russians, Greeks, Hungarians, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, and those people overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party. The parties were very, very close in terms of the numbers of people who supported them. Yes, the Republicans won the Senate most of this time because they had more states, and they also had tended to win the Electoral College, but the popular vote was always very close. If you look at this graph, you'll see that the difference in the popular vote in presidential elections was very small during this time period. The Republicans might have won most of that time, but it was always by very slim margins, thanks to the weirdness of the Electoral College. The number of people who voted for Republicans and Democrats during this time was very, very, very much even. As a result of there being such a close popular vote during this time, such parity between the supporters of Republicans and Democrats, neither party, not surprisingly, chose to make very bold policy, take very bold policy positions. Here in this primary source, you can see a contemporary observer saying just that. When he writes that neither party has, as a party, anything definite to say on many important issues. Neither party has any clean-cut principles, any distinctive tenets. Both have traditions, both claim to have tendencies, both have certain war cries, organizations, interests enlisted in their support. But those interests are in the main interests of getting or keeping the patronage of the government. Distinctive tenets and policies and points of political doctrine have all but vanished. All has been lost except office or the hope of it. In other words, what this contemporary observer is saying is that all that people cared about, what these two political parties cared about was winning elections any way that they could in order to control the giving out of government jobs. As far as actual policies, there were very, very few differences between the two parties. There were a few that were important differences. For example, the Republican Party wanted to impose higher tariffs to protect American businesses, while the Democrats preferred to have lower tariffs in order to facilitate lower prices for goods, which was good for the working class, for example. The Republican Party tended to prefer a tight currency policy and preferred to have federal currency tied to the gold standard, while the Democrats were interested in having a looser, more inflationary currency policy and the coinage of silver. You're going to learn more about this when you get to the populist in the next few days, to the labor and farm protest movements. Republicans also believed in funding for transportation and other infrastructure. So, for example, the building of railroads with government money, or by giving government money government support, federal lands, etc., to railroad companies so that they would continue to build railroads. One thing that did occur that was significant politically during this time was civil service reform. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Like I said before, politicians in this era were more interested in getting elected and then having the control of the patronage than in really genuine political issues. And what I mean by patronage is, the federal government had many, many, many thousands of jobs available. I'm talking about everything from postal workers to, other administrators in the federal government, bureaucrats, people who worked professional jobs primarily, working for the federal government. It was still very small compared to today. Today there's, several million federal employees. Back then there are, close to 100,000 or so federal employees. And remember that Andrew Jackson kind of started this tradition of having presidents and their administrations kick out all of the people who had the federal jobs before they came in and put in their place their own supporters. This was called patronage. It was a way to reward people who supported you. It was kind of getting out of control by this time period. For example, President James Garfield, the Republican president who was elected in 1880, when he took office in 1881, he had 100,000 federal jobs to fill. Now, obviously, he didn't do that all himself, but he and his mostly people who worked for him basically parceled out those jobs to the supporters of the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. and other places where the federal government had offices. This was kind of the way, the accepted way of doing things in Washington, and it's the reason why people wanted to win elections. They wanted to have the power to give other people jobs in the federal government, and that could lead to some, a great deal of power. One of the more important sources of power during this time for politicians. Well, something happened in 1881. James Garfield, just very soon after taking office, he was shot. He was assassinated. He was assassinated by somebody who was mad because he didn't get a federal job under the Garfield administration. Garfield did die of his wounds, and Garfield's assassination led to a public outcry. People said enough is enough when it comes to patronage. We have to fix this system. It can't be all about just giving your buddies jobs. So Congress, pushed by the public outcry over the assassination of a president, right, a sitting president, passes the Pendleton Act in 1881. The Pendleton Act is basically a form of civil service reform. Civil service, or the civil service, is the group of people who work for the government. Civil service reform is the reform of or fixing of problems with the civil service. The Pendleton Act addressed civil service reform by identifying certain jobs in the federal government that should be filled on the basis not of patronage, meaning you give that job to a buddy or a supporter, but rather on the basis of a competitive exam. For some jobs, people were supposed to take an exam, and whoever got the highest scores, therefore was the most qualified for that job, that's the person who was supposed to get the job. So this ushered in a new era in the federal government. At first, only 10% of federal jobs were subject to the civil service exams under the Pendleton Act, but over time, over the next few decades, more and more of those jobs were put under the Pendleton Act. Today, more than 90% of federal jobs are filled through on the basis of merit, as opposed to giving your buddies and supporters the jobs because you like them. The vast majority of federal jobs today, from the lawyers who work for the Internal Revenue Service to the FBI, agents, to NASA, these people are hired on the basis of whether or not they might be good at that job, as opposed to hired because they're buddies of somebody in the presidential administration currently. So whereas while at first it was only a very small number of jobs, it eventually grew to become most federal jobs. And so patronage pretty much eventually over the next few decades went away, and all because of the assassination of James Garfield, this president you never heard of, who had a huge impact on how federal jobs are distributed in the long run. And that is all I got to say about that.